First off, I wanted to introduce myself real quick. Again, my name is Joe Crumbley. I'm the Urban Agriculture Program Coordinator here with the Snohomish Conservation District. And here we have a recent community garden installation we've done in partnership with the Northshore YMCA as well as the City of Bothell. So we've done some great additions to this corridor here with a little bit of sunlight and these raised beds and our irrigation system. We're setting up a great example of how you can implement an urban agricultural installation to increase access to locally sourced nutritious food. Okay, so who will benefit from this garden space? We mentioned that the Northshore YMCA youth programs will be involved in this area, and so we're going to benefit both their educational components of early STEM learning and curriculum in an urban agricultural setting, but we're also going to benefit the Northshore Totes to Go program. This is a local food security effort that benefits students on the free and reduced lunch program in the area. And so these raised beds will actually be able to grow perishable food to be added into the Totes to Go program, which is great. Oftentimes with food security programs, they're going to have a lot of, canned goods and non-perishable items, and it's really great to be able to help increase access to fresh, local, healthy fruit and produce. This garden space will be maintained primarily by the folks involved in this garden space at the Y, so that can be staff as well as youth in before and after school programs, as well as summer camps, kind of connecting them to where their food comes from and having that educational component in a space that's really visible for the local community. So some aspects that will be required for this garden space to thrive and these fruits and vegetables to succeed from start to finish include adequate sunlight. Typically you're going to want to choose as an individual homeowner who may be looking in and attending this educational elements of this garden space class. You're going to want to think about how this can relate to your own setting. A lot of things can be kind of site specific to your environment, so thinking about placing these beds north to south, reducing the shading from plant to plant, thinking about the sunniest part of your yard. So typically in the peak of the growing season, you're going to want at least around 8 hours of direct sunlight a day to have the most options in your garden space. So for some options that maybe don't require quite as much sunlight, you can go with some leafy greens, different root vegetables, but for a lot of the sunnier portions for these raised beds, you're going to want to prioritize things like from the nightshade family, some peppers, some tomatoes, some tomatillos, things like that. When thinking about what grows well in what site specifically, based on your specific location, you're going to think about aspects of companion planting, what kinds of nutrients will specific vegetable varieties give back into the soil and what will they take away. And then from there, the conservation district can maybe provide a free site visit for you to help understand some of those details. Also talking about crop rotation. If you have the same plant growing year to year in a garden space, you're often going to develop things like fungal or bacterial issues in the soil. So how can you mitigate that from occurring? So crop rotation is a great thing to implement as well. Thinking about adequate water, when you have a drip irrigation system like this attached to a rainwater catchment system, such as a rain barrel, a tote, or a cistern, it really can reduce the labor and upkeep overall as far as maintaining the garden space. So that's a great component, but when you're thinking about moisture in the soil itself, you also want to have a balance of well-draining soil to kind of mitigate any stagnant water from developing in the raised beds. You can see that this bed here is oftentimes used for things like a horse trough on a farm. For metal beds with a bottom in there, you're going to want to actually drill some holes in there to make sure that if you're growing food at home, that you don't have water stagnating at the bottom of the bed and giving you some soil health issues. For these raised beds here made out of wood, these were actually recycled from the waste stream, so a lot of times we get either donated lumber or lumber that's used previously as a shipping container, which is great. I mentioned that sometimes in these programs we like to find a balance between natural resource conservation and food security practices. So this is another example of reducing components going into the waste stream, whether it's building materials or composting more at home or in these garden settings. You can really think about how can we keep things in a closed loop system as much as possible, whether it's the compost or the rainwater we're harvesting or these building materials we're utilizing into a raised garden bed. All these things can come into play to save these natural resources. So how do the rain barrels work? As you can see, the rain barrels are going to be connected to your gutter system up above. So oftentimes we'll get PVC pieces here in two 90-degree angles to come down and be directly overhead of this hole in the top of the rain barrel. If you can see from here, we have a filter to make sure that any sediment coming from the roof doesn't go into the rain barrel itself. If you have any questions about maintenance or upkeep, if you have happened to purchase a rain barrel from the Conservation District, feel free to reach out to us anytime. Like I said, we not only will provide these resources to communities to increase their access to locally sourced nutritious food or rainwater catchment systems, but we'll also tell them, the technical expertise of how to succeed with implementing these different resources. So here is the overflow. So anytime the rain barrel gets full and the drip irrigation system isn't on for whatever reason, you can also attach a hose here and then divert the water elsewhere to make sure it's not going to drip into near your building's foundation. Here, of course, is the spigot at the very bottom where it's directly attached, in this case, to a soaker hose. Soaker hoses are typically used in setups like this where you don't have a lot of water pressure to work with, where you're not using, let's say a pump or something that's higher up than this rain barrel is currently. This is a great way to have a low pressure system that still gets the water where it needs to go, all the way 10, 15, 20 feet away into some of these other beds further down this walkway here. Another neat thing that you can kind of implement to reduce the maintenance and upkeep of watering at home is you can actually attach a timer that would go in between this spigot and the soaker hose here, so you can even reduce the maintenance and labor involved in watering even further, which is really great. One section we'd like to talk about is how does the irrigation work? As you can see, we have a drip irrigation system here, which is doing the watering for us. But if you happen to have just a watering can at home and access to an outside spigot where you can attach a hose or just water your watering can directly, you're going to want to think about how long you're going to water specific vegetable varieties in the peak of the growing season. This, of course, will depend on the heat and the sunlight that you receive at your specific site. But in general, you're going to want to water most vegetable varieties around an inch of water every week. And so, of course, if you have a heat dome like we experienced in this region recently this past summer, you're going to want to water much more frequently. But in general, around an inch of water a week is a good rule of thumb. An easy way to go about doing this can include using an empty tuna can and timing yourself how long does that take to water that tuna can with your specific gardening method. So if you are just standing over the tuna can and holding the watering can above it and watering that way, just time yourself how long that takes. If you have a drip irrigation system like we do here, and you want to know how long an inch of water would take to get into the specific root mass of the vegetable you've planted in your raised bed, you can actually have maybe a timer attachment as well to go hand in hand with this irrigation system, and turn it on and then look at that tuna can over time and see how long that takes to fill up with water. And that's typically, again, about a week's worth of water for an inch on that tuna can. So I mentioned earlier that most of these raised beds in this garden space are used from previously used shipping containers. So we're finding a way to upcycle these building materials into a raised garden bed. Another great component or aspect of these garden beds is actually weed suppression. As you can see here, this garden space, we've surrounded the raised garden beds with fine gravel, which does a great job of suppressing weeds around the base of the bed. As you can imagine, when there's a bottom to these raised beds, the weeds are not going to come up from the bottom, but actually from weeds germinating around the perimeter of the garden bed. And so thinking about whether it's sheet mulching, which includes adding cardboard and then compost and then wood chip mulch to suppress those weeds around the raised garden bed area, or implementing gravel or even certain landscape fabric or cloth down, all these things are great ways that you can go about reducing weeds. Typically, other than the weeds germinating around the perimeter of the bed, sometimes you'll have, birds carrying seeds or dropping them in the raised bed, or squirrels drop certain things from time to time. But in general, it's quite rare to have weeds popping up in the top of the raised bed unless it's from the perimeter of the bed. Another great component of these raised beds include saving your back or your knees and not having to bend down quite as much. So the higher the raised bed, of course, the less you're going to have to lean over when you're doing this maintenance and upkeep of weeding over time, which is a really great aspect of them. Additionally, you don't want to have a bed built that's going to be, too wide where you're not going to be able to reach the center of the raised bed. So when thinking about implementing that at home and what size you may want to implement, just keeping in mind that you don't want it too wide because you, of course, don't want to have to get up and walk around inside the raised bed. Going back to soil health really quick, the least amount that you can actually compact the topsoil in the raised bed, the better the beneficial insects and microbes are going to be over time. And so, of course, we want to eliminate any walking or trampling in the soil inside the raised bed. can be grown in this garden successfully. A lot of what folks will want to keep in mind is what planting zone you're working in. So in Snohomish County alone, you have around 8 different planting zones that have to do with the first and the last frost date and what can be grown in that growing season in between those 2 times. So when you're thinking about this garden space here specifically, we're actually located in Zone 8B. Zone 8B actually is working with the first frost date of December 1st and the last frost date typically of April 1st. And so thinking about what time of year, what vegetable variety will work the best, you want to keep those dates in mind. And also thinking about, you know, as we spoke about before, the planting plan and keeping in mind companion planting, crop rotation, and overall soil health when considering these various options. So how long do certain things take to grow? That can really depend on the vegetable variety you're working with. It can take as little as 70 days all the way up to 120 days to grow from start to finish, where you can eventually harvest it and serve it in your household or provide it to a local food bank to address food security efforts. So typically some of the produce options that take closer to 70 days to grow include things like cucumber, radish, lettuce, beans, spinach, summer squash, and then some of the more common vegetable varieties that will take a little bit longer, close to 120 days, can include things like pumpkins, cauliflower, peas, cabbage, garlic, tomatoes, winter squash, onions. So it really just depends based on the specific produce variety, what you're working with, and how long that will take to grow. A great thing that you can do as an individual homeowner to get a jump start on the growing season is you can actually grow a lot of these varieties by seed in your own home. Whether you have a greenhouse, a hoop house, or even a windowsill, you can often reuse things like old egg cartons and fill them with soil and compost and start seeds from there. You can even propagate certain vegetable varieties you receive at the store. Let's say you have a head of romaine lettuce, some onions, some chives, celery, things like that that will actually have a remaining root system or root mass at the base of what you've purchased. So you can eat away all that romaine lettuce. If you are still left with a root mass at the base of that lettuce head, you can actually stick that in a cup of water, put it on the windowsill, and after a few days you're going to see those roots trickle down to the water to nourish itself. And so after a few days of that, you can eventually transplant those specific produce varieties into a cup on the windowsill with some dirt and water it every so often to eventually transplant that outside into your garden space and again reduce the local food waste from vegetable scraps from the store. So another great way to both address food security efforts and resource conservation. So lastly, we want to cover winterizing your garden space, how and why you should overwinter in your garden area. So this can include aspects like putting in cover crops. Typically folks will use in this area clovers or things from the legume family, which include peas and beans. These varieties are actually what's called a nitrogen fixer, so they will add nitrogen into the soil. So once the next growing season comes about, you're going to still have that soil health maintained over time in the off season. Having a cover crop also is really great to reduce nutrients from leaching out of the soil during some of the harsher climate winter months that we experience in the Pacific Northwest. So thinking about how you can do that without cover crops. You can also maintain that soil health by adding various mulches to the top of the garden beds, maybe a thicker layer of compost. You can add some dried hay or various alfalfas to the top of the beds. All these things can work wonders for maintaining soil health in the off-season. Whenever you're thinking about adding organic material like compost to the raised bed to maintain soil health during the winter months, you want to make sure that it's cured as much as possible and has broken down to where it's no longer green organic matter, but in fact it's actually fully decomposed and is in the cured phase of the process. That way you're making sure that it's actually going to be giving back nutrients to the soil rather than taking away nutrients to the soil. So there's a big difference between using raw versus cured compost. Snohomish Conservation District's Lawns to Lettuce program is great for not only large impact sites like we have here in this community garden space, but also applicable for individual homeowners as well. So if you're an individual homeowner in Snohomish County and you're looking to be involved in our Lawns to Lettuce program, feel free to reach out to us through phone or email, and we can set up a site visit to help assess your property if it's a good fit. You can also find our Lawns to Lettuce funding page at snohomishcd.org. And then we have a program drop-down menu where you then select Lawns to Lettuce and click the funding option. And that's a way for any individual homeowner to apply for our cost share reimbursement program through the Lawns to Lettuce program. Anytime someone is applying for this, the more they can emphasize that they have a site with high visibility, a high community impact, any educational components that are there, as well as a connection to local food security efforts. Those are all things that will greatly increase your chances of receiving the Lawns to Lettuce Cost Share Award.